Awesome. Okay, welcome. This is how to solve any problem. And the thing that I always start with when I talk about problem solving is two steps. The first step is understanding the problem. The second step is creating the solution. The reason this is so obvious, but the reason I spell it out is because if you're anything like me, you develop some assumptions, some conclusions about the problem fairly quickly. And then more often than not, we dive into the solution. And so I think it's always great to remind ourselves to take a step back and really understand the problem. And that's what we're going to dedicate this session to, is getting a really good sense of what the problem actually is and drilling into the root cause. We don't ever want to be solving for the symptoms of a problem. We want to drill right into the root cause of the problem and solve for that. Otherwise, we're just putting Band-Aids on a broken arm, so to speak. So I'm going to share with you my method for understanding the problem today. And I'm going to really break it down into something specific and concrete. I think this method is really, really powerful for understanding the problem at a root cause level. And once I show you this method, the solution will often reveal itself naturally, organically. You won't even have to really do a lot of work into developing the solution because you will have such a good understanding of what the root cause of the problem is. All right, so we're going to start with understanding the problem. Now, the problem with problems. Generally, when we talk about personal problems, what we're most apt to do as humans is we talk in a very general sense, and we also talk in a very abstract way about the problem. So, for example, we might say something like, or we might catch ourselves thinking life is hard. Although we might never say that out loud, we might think to ourselves, our default thinking is life is hard. Or in an abstract way, my friend is heartbroken. And so when we think in the general or the abstract, what tends to come up, at least for me, is feelings of overwhelm. When I think life is hard, I feel overwhelmed, or I might feel powerless, like, oh, it's just this broad, huge systematic problem that doesn't really have a solution. So I'll offer today that we're going to get rid of the general and the abstract, and we're going to create a problem statement that is both specific and concrete. And the way that we do that is with the problem solving method that I'm going to share with you today. This method will help you to get more specific and concrete about the problem, and it will also help you to drill into the root cause of the problem. And this method is called the self-coaching model. So for those of you in the audience who are familiar with the Life Coach School, which is where I did my life coaching certification, this self-coaching model is something that's foundational to the life coaching method. So if you want more information about this, there is lots of information about it. But my favorite is the Life Coach School podcast, episode 1, dives deeply into the self-coaching model. And so that's if you want more information, but I'm going to share with you all of the elements of it today so that you can put it to work right away. So what is the self-coaching model? So if you want to follow along as you're watching this video, what I'll invite you to do is grab a piece of paper and a pen, and along the left-hand column, just write the abbreviations CTFAR. It's a formula that helps us to identify the root cause of the problem. And it also leads us to developing the next stage of the formula. So I'll break it down for you. So the C stands for circumstance. The circumstance of any problem is our opportunity to get really specific and concrete. And when we're talking about the circumstances, we want to be as neutral and factual as possible. So no adjectives, no adverbs, and would everyone agree that this is a fact? So an example of a circumstance might be something like, there are 10 cars on the street. Now that looks different than a thought. A thought is an opinion, an assessment, a judgment, an idea, a belief. It's just something that kind of pops into our heads. And if you believe the colloquial wisdom around thoughts, we have like 60,000 of them a day. So we're not even really consciously aware of all of our thoughts, but they're happening on an automatic default level all the time. And so if a circumstance is something like there's 10 cars on the street, very factual, a thought might be something like the street is busy. So that's how we differentiate for the purposes of this model between a thought and a circumstance. The F stands for feeling. I love that we include feelings in the self-coaching model. And for someone who's, this might surprise you, for those of you who know me, you know I'm very logical, left brain thinker, very linear, very formula-based. However, what I tend to do is I tend to overlook the emotional component of problem solving, of decision making. So bringing the feelings into this model helps us to recognize and use that information to our benefit instead of causing us to avoid or sort of getting busy as a result of our feelings. And as you know, I always like to say feelings fuel action. And action in this sense of the word is something that you do or you don't do as a result of that feeling. And I'm going to run through some examples here. I know I'm really kind of theoretical at this point, so it'll come together when I run through the example. But for the purposes of this demonstration, action is something that you do or don't do as a result of the feeling. And then finally, R stands for result. And that result is when you take this action or you don't take this action, what is the result for you? So for example, when I procrastinate, I get behind, or when I snap at my colleague, I feel guilty. So when I do this action, what is the result or the experience that I have? What is the result for me? So that's the model in a nutshell. And it's very simplistic at the risk of undermining the powerfulness of this model. So let's run through some examples. So this model can apply to any problem that you have. And some of the more common productivity problems that I see and that we apply this to are things like, there's too much to do. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do, or I don't know what to do first. I'm stressed out. My boss or my job is too demanding. There's not enough time. I don't feel like it. So those are some of the more common productivity problems that I see in my practice. If I had to summarize those problems into 3 buckets, it's basically a lack of clarity, overwhelm, or motivation. So how do we apply the self-coaching model, the thought model, to these problems? I'm going to take an example. Let's do a demonstration on the first one, which was there's too much to do. So there's too much to do. Let's do a little exercise with this right now, actually. There's too much to do. If you think that thought and you really invest all of your energy into it, what is the emotion that comes up for you when you think that thought? For me, when I think there's too much to do, I feel overwhelmed. I feel powerless. I also, and this is because of my own natural biases, I feel like that's a problem. There's too much to do. However, it's so interesting that somebody else could have that exact same thought and with a different bias have a different sense of what's happening. So, for example, they might think there's too much to do for me to ever get bored. When I think that thought, there's too much for me to do for me to ever get bored. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's amazing. I'll never get bored. So it inspires a different set of feelings. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to first break this down and get really specific and concrete around it. So there is too much to do. Well, first of all, is this even a problem? What is too much? Too much to me might be too little for you and vice versa. And what does that mean? There is too much to do. Where is there too much to do? At home, at work, for my entire life, for this stage of my life, where is there too much to do? So we're going to break all of that down. So there's too much to do. Where would we plug that into the model? Is that a circumstance? Is that a thought? Is that a feeling, an action, or a result? I'll invite you to put your ideas into the chat box if you like. There is too much to do. Yeah, exactly. There is too much to do is a thought. It's not a circumstance, which is interesting because a circumstance would have to be factual. And we've already seen that this is very abstract in general, and not everyone would agree that there's too much to do. So it's a thought, it's an assessment of a circumstance. Now, so we've got the one element of the model filled out already. And what we'll do is we'll take that thought and we'll flesh out the rest of the elements subsequent to it. So in terms of how does that thought make me feel? I already mentioned that that thought makes me feel overwhelmed. I'm curious if you had that same thought, there's too much to do. What feeling would you have? Feel free to put that in the chat box if you like. Another one that came up was powerless. There's too much to do. Feels kind of like there's not much point. Powerless, futility maybe is another one. When I feel overwhelmed, what's the action that I take or the lack of action? And so for me, when I feel overwhelmed, and I'll invite you to do this for yourself, when you feel overwhelmed, what do you do from that space? So for me, I spin in my brain, spin around like, oh, there's too much to do. What should I do? I don't know what to do. When I'm spinning around in my brain, sometimes I'll do nothing. It just looks like from an outward appearances, I'm just sitting here worrying, thinking, ruminating. Or I even like get busy just on the nearest thing because that sense of overwhelm feels so uncomfortable that I want to just get rid of that feeling and start taking action. Because when we take action, then for me, I'm not ruminating, I'm not spinning in the overwhelm or the stressed out feeling. So I call that the freeze or frantic response. And I'm curious for you, when you're feeling overwhelmed, stressed out, powerless, are you more inclined to freeze, as in like spin in your own brain? Or are you more inclined to get frantic and start just doing stuff, get busy getting busy? You're welcome to put that in the chat box if you like. Are you more freeze or frantic? Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I can actually be both. And what I'll also offer, which is fascinating, is that a form of freezing is actually frantic. So freezing can look like just stopping and doing nothing, but it can also look like avoidance activities like over planning, overthinking, overeating, going and Netflix. Like that all feels like action. So sometimes that, aside from the Netflix, it can feel productive, but really it's just a way of avoiding the overwhelm. I'll offer that to you in case that sparks some insights for you. And then what's the result of that spinning, that doing nothing, or getting busy on the nearest thing? And for me, that's no progress, because I'm just doing whatever's coming at me, whatever's nearest, whatever's most urgent. So I'm not necessarily making progress on the important things, or I'm procrastinating, I'm not doing anything, and things are accumulating in the background. So now that we've kind of mapped out what that thought leads to in terms of feelings, what the feeling leads to in terms of actions, and what the action leads to in terms of results, it's an interesting exercise to get really clear on that circumstance. Before I go there, what I find fascinating about this model as well is that the result, the no progress and things accumulating, tends to reinforce the original thought. So for me, the original thought was there is too much to do. When there's no progress being made and things are accumulating, it just reinforces, it gives me more evidence for that thought, there's too much to do. So let's take a look at what the circumstance would be, and let's get really specific and concrete about that circumstance. So I'm going to use an example that actually occurred this past week. So I was thinking about the things that I had to do for the next 2 days. So my example is my thoughts around the upcoming 2 work days. And what I recognized in terms of circumstances, the things that I really wanted to get done for those 2 days is I wanted to prep for this workshop. I wanted to advertise this workshop. I wanted to deliver the workshop. I wanted to record a podcast episode. And I wanted to post the workshop and the materials, the replays, everything onto the membership site. So what I came up with is 5 concrete things that I wanted to accomplish over the next 2 days. Now, you could get even more specific and concrete about these examples. And what I'll offer is that the more specific and concrete that you get, the more clarity that you'll get around the root cause and the potential solution. So for example, I could break down the prep for the workshop and really understand what the deliverable is. And so an example of that would be completing the PowerPoint presentation and having done a rehearsal of it. That's what prep for the workshop means in concrete terms. But for the purposes of this workshop, we'll just say there's 5 things. And we'll put those 5 things into the circumstance line, 5 things in 2 days. And what's fascinating is that when I get really clear and concrete on the circumstance, my thought changes, which is fascinating. It doesn't always change, let's be clear, but more often than not, the specificity and the concreteness really tends to make me think about the circumstance in a different way. So for me, the thought that I was having once I defined all of that was, this is manageable. And so getting really clear on the circumstances can change our thoughts, which is fascinating. When you do this exercise for yourself, what I'll invite you to do is check out a couple of different options for thoughts. As humans, we tend to get locked into our black and white thinking, that cognitive bias, which is like, it's either this or this. There's really only 2 options. When I get really clear and specific on the circumstances, I find it serves me well to experiment with a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different perspectives. So just one of them was, this is manageable. Another one might be something around whether or not I even want to commit to those 5 things, or whether or not I want to do 5 different things, or how this is easy, or this is all coming together, or this is enjoyable. That's one of my favorite thoughts. I love putting together PowerPoints. Oh, it sounds funny when I say it out loud, but I do really love it. And that, when I think that thought, I love delivering workshops. The feeling that I get from that is entirely different than the feeling that I get from there's too much to do. And I'll invite you to experiment with that for yourself. But when I'm playing with this one thought, this is manageable, it actually leads to a different feeling. So you'll recall the previous feeling was overwhelmed. With the thought, this is manageable, the feeling for me is empowered. This is easy. I can wrap my arms around it. It's clear to me what needs to happen next. All of those types of thoughts are an empowered feeling. I'd love to check in with you in the chat box and understand, when you think this is manageable, what's the feeling that comes up for you? If you want to chat, put that in the chat box. Love to see it. This is manageable. Empowered. Empowered sounds very, very strong. But for me, that's what I feel. In control. Yeah, awesome. I love it. Productive. Yeah, awesome. Okay, good. Love it. When I feel empowered, what I do from that space of empowered is typically I create a plan. So it's different than just doing the very next thing. When I say I create a plan, what I mean is I get strategic. I create a plan around the most important things. So those 5 things, when I think this is manageable, I break it down, I get strategic about it, and then I get to work. And then the result of that is that I actually move the needle. I make some progress on those 5 things. So you can see that I get a completely different result with a different thought. And what I'll offer is that the circumstances in both of those models was the same, which is so interesting. When I was thinking there's too much to do, I had the exact same amount of things to do as when I was thinking this is manageable. And yet the feelings, the actions, and the results that I got from each of the models was very different. I'd offer one was a very unproductive model based on a very unproductive thought. And this one is a more productive model based on a productive thought. So the way we think about our circumstances can change our results. And I think this is where if I had to peek, I would love to peek inside Albert Einstein's brain. That would be fascinating. But I think this is partly where he was going when he said we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Because if we continue to think there's too much to do, we continue to create the same result for ourselves. When we change our thoughts, our perspectives, and we start thinking about how things are manageable, things are opportunities rather than problems, we create different feelings, different actions, and different results for ourselves. So the takeaways so far, what I'm hoping you're getting from this is that getting really clear, specific, and concrete around the circumstances can really impact our thoughts. And this is important because our thoughts are directly related to our results. Our thoughts impact our results. Okay, let's do some examples. I would love to walk through an example with you. So if you would like to, if you would like me to promote you to be a panelist, we could walk through this model with a problem from your own productivity, or you're welcome to jot it into the chat box too. And don't worry too much about articulating it as any of the elements in the model. We'll do that together. So in your own words, just let me know either in the chat box or by raising your hand. What is the problem, basically? Okay, so a couple of the examples that we have here are, one is stuck. I hear this one quite a bit. And what that looks like is typically someone will say, I don't know what to do. Stuck usually is preceded by the thought, I don't know, ... So let's take this example and let's plug it in. So we don't know really what the circumstance is at this point in time. Just we just know the thought, which is, I don't know what to do. That one's quite common. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to do this. Often any version of I don't know, basically. And the feeling that comes up, so I'd love it if you might write your feeling in the chat box. When you're thinking, I don't know, in any context, what's the feeling that comes up for you? Yeah. Yeah. Helplessness. Awesome. Good. Yeah. I don't know. Powerlessness. Ineffectiveness. Yeah. Futility. Yeah. Futility is one that comes up. It's often articulated as a thought, like I might as well not proceed, basically. But futility, I think, is a really good word for capturing that in the feeling sense. Okay, good. So then when I'm feeling helpless or powerless, what's the action that I take from that feeling? I have my own thoughts on that, but what are your thoughts in the chat box? Avoid. Yeah. Give up. Exactly. Stress eat. Beautiful. Stress eat, stress shop, stress drink, stress work. That was one of my favorites, is all forms of like getting busy to avoid a feeling. So those are awesome examples. Okay. And then the result, what's the result that we create when we are indulging in stress activity, or when we're avoiding, or when we're giving up? What are your thoughts in the chat box? What's the result that we're creating for ourselves? I can tell you the one that comes up for me a lot is the lack of progress contributes and gives evidence for my thought that I don't know, because I'm not taking action to resolve it. I'm not looking at it as something that has a solution. So I continue to be stuck, basically. Yeah, the problem becomes bigger and bigger in our psyche. Yeah, exactly. Isn't that the truth? The longer we avoid it, the bigger it feels, the more monumental it feels. Okay, awesome examples. Now I'm going to go back and work through one other example. We've already done the overwhelmed example. I think now we'll do the unmotivated example. So this is another one that comes up a lot in a productivity coaching practice, and that's the example of unmotivated, or I don't feel like it. oh, you know what? We didn't actually go through the circumstance on the previous one. So let's take a moment to do that right now, because that is one of the most important parts. So you'll recall that the thought was, I don't know what to do. The feeling was one of stuck, helpless, powerless, futility. The action was avoidance. And the result was that we didn't take any steps to figure it out. So we gathered more evidence for the fact that we didn't know what to do. So the circumstance, if we wanted to break that down, we would get really specific about it. And I'll just give you an example. I often have this thought around figuring out new technology. So particularly when it's something like, my podcast. That's a perfect example. So the technology that was required for me to actually create the podcast was somewhat familiar to me, but publishing it on all the different platforms on Spotify and all that kind of stuff, that was brand new to me. And so to the point of the person who said that these problems become bigger in our psyche the longer we avoid them, in my mind, the podcast got bigger and bigger the longer that I delayed and avoided it. And so the circumstance that we would have used in that example was publishing my first episode of my podcast onto the various platforms. That was the circumstance. And then the thought that came out of that was, I don't know how, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, next time in part 2 of our problem solving workshop, we're going to talk about solutions. However, you can imagine that once I had fleshed out all of the components of the model around this particular circumstance in terms of creating the podcast, I'm sure, spoiler alert, you'll know that once I figured it out, it was actually so easy, it's almost embarrassing. So but the solution revealed itself just in becoming more aware of the problem, because I knew that I was spinning around and that I was creating that for myself. So the solution was to interrupt that spinning and just create more of a strategy around it, interrupt it. Okay, good. So let's go back now and use the unmotivated example. So unmotivated. Unmotivated is a what? Thought, feeling, action. What are your thoughts in the chat box? Yeah. Yeah. It could actually be, I was thinking feeling, but it could be a thought as well in terms of like, I am unmotivated. So it could be a thought. The one that comes up a lot rather than I am unmotivated on the thought line is something like, I don't feel like it. I don't want to. Those are kind of the thoughts that lead to feelings of unmotivated, apathetic, and I don't want to. What are some other feelings? When you think I don't feel like it or I don't want to, resistance is the one that comes up a lot. If you could term that as a feeling, that one often comes up. So the action that we take from that place of apathetic, bored, resistance, the action is typically avoidance. I avoid it. If I don't want to do it, I'm going to find any excuse to avoid it. And the result of avoiding it is that I continue to not feel like it. I just find evidence and reasons why I should continue to avoid it. So it becomes a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle. And again, next time we'll talk more about how to interrupt that cycle. For those of you who aren't able to join us next time, what I will offer now is that a really quick trick is just to interrupt it at one of these lines. And I like to interrupt it at the thought line. And the reason for that is because it is often easiest to change the perspective around something. So something as easy as adding the word yet. I haven't figured this out creates a different feeling than I haven't figured this out yet. Isn't that interesting the way that can do that? So simply by changing your perspective on something can lead to a different feeling, a different action, and a different result. So it's all around finding those productive thoughts that work in the circumstance that you're dealing with. And a lot of times when we're looking for a solution, we're tempted to change the circumstance. And you can do that, absolutely. Like, for example, when I was cutting out carbs, instead of buying carbs, I just like got them all out of my house. So it became really easy to cut out carbs when carbs weren't available to me. However, what I'll suggest to you is that you can still have the circumstance be the same. I can still have the chips in the cupboard and change my perspective around them so that I don't even have the desire, the urge for the chips, the carbs, whatever it is anymore. So that is a possibility, which is fascinating because changing the circumstance, I feel like, is a temporary, it's a Band-Aid solution. So I'm still going to go to the birthday party. I'm still going to go to social events. I'm still going to be met with carbs or whatever that circumstance is. So it's more effective for me to change my thoughts to be more productive, to manage around those circumstances instead of changing those circumstances. What are your thoughts in the chat box? I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so if this is something that you are interested in, I'd like to share with you that I have a free course on my website, financialwellnesscoach.ca. A tab at the top says free course. And the free course offers 3 tools for changing perspective around each of the 3 things that we talked about today. So you will receive, once you sign up for it, you will receive a video, a short video every day into your email inbox. Day 1, it's a tool around changing your perspective around stuck. So getting unstuck. Day 2 is tools to eliminate overwhelm. So changing your perspective on overwhelm. And day 3 is around creating motivation. So changing your perspective to create productive thoughts that create productive action that then leave you with motivation. Each of the videos also comes with a worksheet. If you're someone who likes to write things down for more objectivity and perspective, you will receive those as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end. We talked all about the self-coaching model and understanding the problem at a root cause level. Next time, we're going to use the exact same model to identify and apply the most effective solution.